In today's review, we find out that your mom was right. You should always watch out for the quiet ones. Hello everybody and welcome to this light novel review. I'm Justus R. Stone, and on this channel I cover all things light novels, reviews like this one, as well as news, countdowns of what's popular in Japan, and the Light Novel podcast gets posted on this channel as well. So if you love light novels or you're just getting interested in them, you should consider subscribing. In this video, I'm going to be reviewing the latest in the Monogatari series, and that is Otorimonogatari. This one by Nisioisin. It's released in English by Vertical. If you want to pick up your own copy, I do have links to Amazon or the Book Depository in the description down below. Now this one sort of follows in the vein of a couple of the more recent light novels in the Monogatari series ever since we started into season 2, as Nisioisin proclaims it, and that is that it does away with Araragi as the narrator and instead hands the first person narration over to Nadeko Sengoku, who is the quiet girl with bangs who we really haven't seen a lot of since all the way back when she first entered into the Monogatari series in Bakemonogatari, in the second volume of the series, where she was a girl whose class was given a bunch of sort of false charms and stuff, but they all believed they were real, and a girl cursed Nadeko, and Nadeko, thinking that it was a legit thing, started sacrificing snakes and stuff, and ended up inviting an honest-to-God real aberration onto her, and a real curse onto herself, which Araragi, Kanbaru, and Oshino helped to cure her of. And like I said, she's kind of been just mentioned. We haven't really seen her much in the last couple of books. And then, boom, out of nowhere, hi there, we have a full-on story featuring Nadeko. So really briefly about what this book is about, because I just want to get talking about it. In this book we have Nadeko Sengoku. She, of course, the girl from Bakemonogatari, and she is basically contacted by an aberration and who is a snake and is guilted because of her slaughter of a bunch of snakes back in her first story to aid this serpent aberration in finding its body so it does not fade away. It's a pretty easy setup, but it creates all sorts of questions as the book is going along. This one, if we're talking timeline-wise, because if you're not aware, Monogatari jumps around time-wise. Like, this one actually happens before the last volume being the one with Kanbaru, where she was the narrator. When she was in that one was set after the graduation of Araragi, Senjogahara, Tsubasa Hanakawa. This one is actually about 6 months or so before their graduation, so we're kind of jumping backwards in the timeline. It's a good and a bad thing in a way. It's kind of a bad thing because the way this book ends, unlike a lot of the other Monogatari books, it kind of ends on a little bit of a cliffhanger, but it's not really a cliffhanger because, well, we already know what happens months after this book. So yeah, it's kind of a weird title in the whole Monogatari series because, as I said, we really haven't had much in the way of cliffhangers in this series. Usually the main sort of thing is dealt with by the end. In a lot of ways, this bears some similarity to Neko Monogatari and Hana Monogatari, which of course were the books that were narrated by Tsubasa Hanakawa and by Kanbaru. This one, of course, as I said, it does feature Nadeko as the narrator, so we move away from Araragi, which means, funny enough, that the books kind of lose a little bit of that whole ecchi kind of edge that Araragi gives into, or the question. It's even not even ecchi sometimes. Sometimes it's just downright questionable. Anyway, moving right along. It bears similarity to those books in that we have a main female character, although I guess it's arguable whether Nadeko is main character. But anyway, we have a female character, a member of Araragi's harem, We have her in a title where she is giving us a sense of who she is inside her own head, as opposed to the impression that we have of her based just on what Araragi sees and his impressions of a person. And it seems very, like, I would say that, like, in the same way that with Kambaru in Hana Monogatari, I was surprised at just how different she was as a person inside her own head, but in a good way. Nadeko is basically the same, like, she's very, very unlike what I thought based on how she was in the earlier books, and not maybe as such a good way. For instance, in Hana Monogatari and Neko Monogatari, both Tsubasa and Kambaru have personal doubts. And I mean, who doesn't when you're a teenager? I mean, come on, that's just par for the course. Heck, I'm way beyond teenager and I got self-doubts. But they still seem to have at least a certain element of self-awareness. And the books were very much journeys about them dealing with their past and dealing with sort of their inner demons. This one, in Otorimonogatari, we see Nadeko, in terms of that whole separation of herself, it's taken to an extreme. Nadeko, for most of the book, refers to herself in the third person, even though it's a first-person narrative. So, generally speaking, when she is talking about her actions, or she is talking about the way that somebody is treating her, she refers to herself as Nadeko. When she is perhaps revealing something that is much more internal, that she is not showing the world, those are the only times that she might use I or me. And what's really interesting in this, and this is kind of a textbook for typography, if you want to go there, is that they never once use the capital I when she refers to I am or I myself. It's always a small I, and this is not something that happens anywhere else in the book. Any other character who refers to themselves in speech and says, I am, I this, or whatever, or, you know, that kind of stuff, it's capitalized. So there is a very concerted effort both in the way that Nadeko speaks and even in the typography itself of the book to sort of show that this character has a great deal of separation in terms of herself, a great deal of a great lack of self-awareness, and perhaps even a great deal of self-worth issues as well. Keeping with the whole idea of typography and how things are written in books, this one also goes a long way to show us that Nadeko really hasn't grown up, that she in a lot of ways is still just kind of hanging on to her own childishness. For instance, she often will use bigger words, but they're misspelled, and it's intentional because the writer, well, the editor and translator, they put these mispronunciations in quotations. So if you sound them out phonetically, they generally sound right, like you know what the word is that she's trying to say. But it's not written correctly. It's I think, imitating much the way that children speak, right? Where they will over-phoneticize a word because you can tell that they know the word and that they sort of understand its meaning, but their mouth just isn't quite used to forming that word because it's not something they use often in their own speech. And so it comes out that you understand it, but it sounds childish because they're over-enunciating and, you know, clearly not in their own mind conceptualizing of the word that we would because we know even how it's spelled. And so I kind of get the sense that there's a lot of that going on in this book too. So in a lot of ways, like you know what, aside from the story, we'll take a pause on talking about the story for a second. I just want to say that, like, the typography, the way things are translated, the way that things are written in this book, I really have to give props to Vertical. Like, I don't know how those things worked in Japanese. I don't know how they were written in a way that this sort of equals, but as a reader, when I'm reading it, these are the impressions that I'm getting. And if I'm right, and I mean, again, this is my interpretation of it, but if I'm right, then I really have to give props to Vertical, because not only are they using the book itself and the narrative itself to tell those types of ideas and everything else, but they're also using the typography, they're also using the way manipulating of spellings and everything else. Really bang up job. You know what, I have to say that, you know, these books, given the complexity sometimes of the wordplay and everything else that Nisioisin and particularly this series is famous for, I think Vertical's done a really, really good job. And they are one of those series that, even given the heaviness of the text, have very, very little grammar issues in the books, or misspellings or misplaced words. And maybe that's just because they do have to give it that extra once over because of Nisioisin and his word plays and manipulations and everything else. So that's my aside on that whole thing. But yeah, it's really cool. And this is actually, I think, one of the first times that I've really been super aware of it in terms of the whole typography in these books as well. In terms of the story and whether you're going to actually like Nadeko as a character, I think this is going to be a very divisive thing. And I mean, I've heard murmurings that this is a very divisive character, and I didn't want to look into it too much because I didn't want to spoil this book, so I kind of went into it blind. Like, I had no idea what happened in this book. I had no idea how it would turn out. I had no idea why some people may not like Nadeko as a character. And I have to say I was kind of surprised by the way that this book went. I was kind of shocked by the way this book ended. And I would not say in a bad way per se. To be honest, as much as I have really enjoyed Hanekawa and Kanbaru's books and enjoyed the journeys that they went on, it was kind of fun to be, you know, 10 plus books into the series. I think this is what, like number 11 or whatever, into this series, and have things be different. Have a character who is very different. Have a character whose speech patterns are so different from anybody else that we have had. And even just the feeling of the book is just so interesting. We've talked in the past in my reviews about this series about how Araragi may be a bit of an unreliable narrator, and that we kind of have seen that even in Kanbaru's books and in Hanekawa's books, we have seen that that is true, but not because Araragi all the time is intentionally lying, but because Araragi has a prejudiced viewpoint. Because he sees Kanbaru and Hanekawa in a certain light, he is making himself intentionally ignorant to other sides of their personalities. And the girls forgive him mostly for that, but we do find out that, you know, there is that element of being unreliable. Nadeko is textbook unreliable. You cannot trust her. And as I said, the way that the book is written, the way that she refers to herself and everything else, it very much hammers home that idea that there is something wrong with this girl. There is some disconnect going on with her. And in some ways, I found that actually really fascinating. I found it very interesting. About the only character I can think of I want to read more in that way would be Senjo Gahara. But then again, we'd probably only get Senjo Gahara as she is now, the improved version, which, I mean, when you actually see her, I don't know how improved she is. But anyway, I would be very interested to read something from her point of view. But Nadeko, I couldn't dislike her. I couldn't hate her. I felt like she was a character that was fighting against a lot of things. Like, for instance, and I know I'm comparing it a lot to, Hana Monogatari and Neko Monogatari, but it's just so easy because those are the other ones that have sort of these female characters taking center stage. And I think that because those ones were so good and happened before this one, I can't help but compare just how different this is. And I think one of the things that bears an interest to me is that in Hana Monogatari and in Neko Monogatari, we have these two female characters who know that the world sees them in a way that they don't really see themselves. That there is a substantial component about who they are as a person that the world doesn't really know. But they are at peace with that. In fact, in some ways it's heavily suggested that they are intentionally projecting that image of themselves and hiding those elements, or, you know, kind of letting those elements just stay in the background of things. I don't get that sense with Nadeko. She seems very different in that manner. She seems like somebody who is struggling with the way that she is perceived by others. She seems to be a character who is, you know, fighting against the way that she has been cast as the quiet, cute girl. And in a way, and again, I cannot speak for Nisioisin. In fact, I was kind of disappointed. His afterword on this one really doesn't go very in-depth into the book. And again, I haven't researched the book a whole lot because I didn't want to have any spoilers. I may do that now that I've read it. I'm just afraid of spoilers down the road. But in any case, the one thing that I almost felt like when I finished this book, I almost felt like this book was kind of meta, you know, that in a way that it's almost like a character fighting against the role that she's actually been cast in within the narrative. That she is a character who has been underused by Nisioisin in all the books. A character who, even in her own story where she was introduced, was kind of minor in a lot of ways. A character that was a victim in a lot of ways. You know, it strikes me that she's fighting against that. It's almost like there's this rage going on inside her, this anger going on inside her to not be that person, because that person has been basically ignored for all of the series up until this point. Again, that's probably just me, and that's probably just me reading too much into the book, but I couldn't help but feel that way. And when I did, I kind of thought like, man, if Nisioisin did intend it to kind of feel like that, it kind of elevates this book, in my opinion. Again, it's going to be divisive. It does kind of just end. It doesn't have quite the resolution, I would say, that a number of the other Monogatari books do. And again, this character, like, I would not say that she is likable, certainly not in the way that Kombaru or Hanakawa are, or just about any other character is. Overall, I wouldn't say that this particular volume is really driven by its story. I mean, I would say that Hana Monogatari in a lot of ways was kind of driven by its mysteries and the plot going on. In this one, it's more driven by Nadeko coming into contact with other characters and seeing how they see her and her reactions to those things. And in a lot of ways, the whole quest idea of trying to find the body of this aberration, I mean, it's really just a drive to push her into situations that are forcing her to face herself and to perhaps get out of her comfort zone. All in all, I would say that Otorimonogatari is a very interesting book, a very different book from the rest of the Monogatari series. I imagine that it is not going to be everybody's piece of cake. The character obviously is nowhere near as likable as a lot of the other Monogatari characters, but she is interesting. And I have to say that the way this book ended, I'm very interested to see where her story goes from here. So those are my thoughts on Otorimonogatari by Nisioisin. My next review is going to be kicking it old school, and I'm going to be reading volume number 1 of Sorceress Stabber Orphan. This one released in English by J-Novel Club. The original release of this series was back in 1994. Makes it like a peer of Slayers and those kind of titles that are some of the very first books that, well, pretty much led the revolution of light novels and gave us the tons of titles that we have today. So I'm looking forward to checking this one out. I actually remember watching the anime of this one back in the 90s. So I'm kind of curious to see what it is and how it reads as a light novel. So if you're brand new to the channel and you love light novels or you're just kind of interested in them, you should subscribe. I do reviews every week, as well as counting down the popular titles in Japan, cover news, and the light novel podcast gets posted here as well. Thank you so much for joining me in this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Till then, bye-bye for now.